I won't try to tell his story as an introduction, because quite frankly it's not mine to tell, and it's much more impactful coming from him. Suffice it to say that Ishmael experienced the Sierra Leone Civil War in a very personal and early manner. His story, however, extends far beyond that particular experience. He started his activism as a teenager as part of the United Nations' first International Children's Parliament, a conference that addressed the devastating impact of war on children in various nations around the world. In the years that followed, Ishmael fled the ongoing conflict in Sierra Leone and then eventually graduated high school and college here in the United States and built on those first steps of activism taken at the International Children's Parliament. He's spoken around the world and shared his experiences as a child soldier and his journey out from the serious impact that had on his life. Eventually, he published these stories and experiences as A Long Way Gone, Memoirs of a Boy Soldier. The book became a bestseller and was nominated for a Quill Award and named one of the top nonfiction books of 2007 by Time magazine. Ishmael has continued his work as an advocate for an end to hostilities and to provide role models for children who are currently struggling to recover from war. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Ishmael Beah.
Thank you very much. I hope everyone is enjoying their lunch. I ate mine fairly quickly. I'm really grateful to be here, and I want to extend my gratitude to everybody who's worked hard to make this happen, and to my close friend in Ukraine, who over the years we've gotten to know each other, and he's been behind me. You have to come to Chicago, and so finally I'm able to make it. So I'm glad to be here. I've been thinking about what it is that. What would my remarks be this afternoon? What would I say to you? And I thought perhaps I'd give a little context to who I am, and through that talk about my experiences with international humanitarian law or national laws, juvenile legal standards, how I've experienced them in the course of those experiences. But also now, as somebody who's on the other side of it, which is that I am a UNICEF ambassador for children affected by war, and what I do in that capacity is to constantly find newer ways to strengthen policy for the protection of children in armed conflict, but also to travel into the countries where these things are happening and witness and be part of negotiations to release children from armed groups. And this requires explaining what international humanitarian law is to some very difficult individuals carrying guns, usually, and that doesn't help when they have the gun. You have to finesse what the responsibility is in a way that they can absorb it as well. And my background is not necessarily a lawyer, though I did apply to law school actually. I got into law school, I took the LSAT, I studied very hard, I passed it, and I applied to law school. I got into a few, and I was about to go to law school when I had a book deal, so I did not go to law school. I instead decided to become an author. I went on to publish other books. My wife, who is a lawyer, says one lawyer is sufficient to the family. And she's very happy that I did not go to law school, even though she went. But I'm still in it too. I'm holding on to that dream, so maybe one day I'll finally go for it. But that being said, before all of this, I was born in Sierra Leone, where Zainab and Binta are from. And I was born in 1980 there, and I grew up in a very remote part of the country where I didn't know much about government or what was going on in politics. I didn't even been to my own capital city. I lived a very simple, beautiful life, as most of Sierra Leone was in those days. But yet I had a great education, because Sierra Leone always had a great educational system. So even though I was in this remote part of the country, I went to school. In Sierra Leone, in those days when I was in school, as soon as you learn how to speak English, you get a little proficiency in it, you start to learn Shakespeare as well. That's what I learned. I grew up knowing how to say, "Friends, Roman countrymen, lend me your ears," without knowing what it meant until much later. So that was kind of my early upbringing, very in a community where everybody took care of you as a kid. In fact, I remember as a kid, I was always troublesome because I always liked to ask questions I wasn't supposed to ask. I had a very curious mind. And one of the things that I really didn't like was the fact that this community looked after you so much to the point that I felt like it was intrusive in your personal life, right? So as a kid, for example, if I didn't want to sit in my math class, which was one of my least favorite classes, I would try to escape. I could not do it because anybody who was older than me would say, "You you're supposed to be in school, and they will hold my ears and take me back to school. So I could not escape these things. I really did not like that part. But I asked questions as a kid when I was very young because I had a very inquisitive mind and a curious mind just to understand how things worked. My grandfather was an imam. So before I went to school to learn English, I learned Arabic. I learned the Quran and I would call azan in the mosque. But I remember having discussions with my grandfather about this idea of order, law, of somebody who we don't know who's up there, who's supposed to tell us how to behave, and we're supposed to listen to what is written in this book. And you know, there's a surah that says that God is not the son of anyone. He's not. He doesn't have a father or mother. So I used to ask my grandfather, but from what I know, how is that possible? I mean, you're my grandfather, so you have your own mother and father. How is that possible? And my grandfather would tell me, don't ask any of the other imams this question, just me. And I said, well, why don't you have an answer for me? There were some things that are just beyond your human comprehension. So, but I was not satisfied. So, I would then go ask my grandmother because maybe she would have an influence on my grandfather and get the information that I needed. But so I grew up where there was this sense of order that was based on the Quran, but not like the Sharia version, but just the understanding of what it meant to be good in the community. But we also had a traditional idea of law and order, which is that I grew up in a place where if there was something in the community, for example, somebody's go to a stolen or somebody's house was destroyed, the village got together and sat around. And I always went to these as a boy. And the elders would deliberate. They would ask the person who had been wronged to explain what happened. And everybody would listen, and they would ask the person who caused the offense to explain why they caused the offense and what happened. And everybody would listen. And the elders would go back and forth, and they would throw it to the audience to see what the punishment could be if whoever was wrong. So this is how my first idea of law and how it works came from these village meetings that we would sit together. And most of the punishments, or what they considered punishment, were not were restorative measures, really. So, for example, if somebody was wrong for destroying somebody's crops, the idea was that your punishment was the next time they wanted to brush their farm and plant their rice, you did it with them. That was your punishment. So what people don't understand from the outside, maybe you think that's not sufficient, but that was sufficient because what that did is that when you spent time to brush a farm with somebody, you went to the farm with them, and you spent an entire day with them brushing the farm, you ate with them, eventually the two of you are going to talk out what happened on your own without the village influence, without anybody, and you're going to come up to a conclusion about how you want to deal with this, how you want to move forward. So that's the sort of life that I grew up in, where wrongs, there was a sense of justice, but it came from everybody being part of it. Now, as I mentioned earlier, I wasn't near the capital city, so the idea of a national law did not really apply to me. I had no sense of what that even meant, that I had a right as a child. None of these things existed. Now, in my country, a civil war started in the early 90s. When I was about 12, the war reached my part of the country and came into my life. Everything I knew as a kid stopped. I started running for my life. I learned how to function in war. Between 12 and 13, my immediate family was killed in the war. So my mother, father, and 2 brothers were killed. I was the second born in a family of 3 boys. And I only survived by pure luck. Chance. I wasn't with them. And I ended up going to a Sierra Leone military base thinking that it was the safest place to go, along with other kids. And this is where I was recruited when I was 13 to become a soldier. So I started fighting as a soldier when I was 13. For nearly 3 years, war became my life. I was no longer that boy who loved Shakespeare, who wanted to become an economist. That's what my father really wanted. I didn't think I wanted that. But that became my life. And I embraced this violence very truly. And there was a sense of, one of the rhetorics of the war, which is really interesting, was this idea of justice. So when we were being recruited, one of the things that we used, besides the coercion, and besides the drugs and the violence that had got us traumatized, there was a rhetoric that was very powerful, which was the idea that we need to hold people responsible for what had happened to you. And being part of this fighting group is going to bring you that justice. You can seek revenge, you can make sure also that this doesn't happen to other children like you. And these things made sense to us. We were angry. We wanted somebody to be responsible for why our lives had ceased to exist the way we knew them. So I joined this group actually embracing those ideas, thinking that I was part of this system. Now that's through war, through also bringing violence to other people, through taking other people's rights away, which was justified because we were the good guys, as every war is. I'm sure all of you know. Every other group that you encounter would never tell you they're the bad guys, they're always the good guys. Everybody has fancy names: National Liberation Movement, Revolutionary United Front. Nobody says anything that's not good, you know. Everybody is right, everybody, whatever they're doing is right. But there's a sense, there's a quest for justice. As a UNICEF ambassador, when I go to these places, I also see that wars start because injustice already exists in some of these places. And the injustice often comes from how governments are able to leave a majority of the population with no access to anything. For example, I was in Central African Republic. Central African Republic only functions in the capital city, Bangui. Outside of Bangui, there is no Central African Republic. So people feel that they are not part of a country, that there's an injustice. So when they sound the bell, other people can jump on the bandwagon, and then they start to violate the rights of other people. And then the issue of accountability comes in, then who is doing what, you know. So somehow, in a very warped way, all of these things, even though the violence goes out of hand, it becomes genocide, becomes human rights issues, at the underpinnings of it are always a sense of we've been wronged and somebody needs to take responsibility. Now, of course, other people jump into it, they take advantage of the situation where there are natural resources and whatnot, and the wars take on different dimensions. But in my case, I was fighting this war believing truly that what I was doing was correct. That I was preventing violence from happening to other people, but yet I was bringing the violence to them. Everybody will try to give you the little sweet tongue of war, which is that, you know, so wars are completely brutal, I'll tell you. There is no room to recognize anybody else's humanity when you're a soldier, when you're fighting in a war, particularly the kind of civil war that I fought in. When you dehumanize somebody else, in reverse, you dehumanize yourself. But in that process, you can't recognize them. You can't tell them, well, I was really a nice boy learning Shakespeare. Do you know Shakespeare? When you're about to shoot them, you can't ask them that question. Because it makes them as human as you are, and therefore you don't have that capacity. So you dehumanize them. So the very act of war, to survive every single day if you're a soldier, requires taking another life. Now somebody else can do it for you. That's the brutal truth of it. So, but as a child, I got good in this war. I was actually a sub-commander. Now, when I came out of this war, it was the time in Sierra Leone. This is a country that I mentioned earlier, why I give you that context of my life, where there was such a strong sense of respect for elders. And during the course of the war, all of that changed to the point that even adults no longer believed in the innocence of children because they'd seen how children operated as basically war machines, where some kids were forced to kill their grandparents in front of the entire community, sometimes with a bayonet so that it can be even more gruesome, or with a gun. Now, when adults who survived these experiences did not see children as purely victims or as innocent children, they wanted to kill you if they could. If you came to their town again, they saw you somewhere else. So when I was living in the capital city, after I was removed from this war by UNICEF and placed in a rehabilitation center, there was a big stigma. No one saw us as victims, they saw us as perpetrators. And to try and explain that to them was very difficult. First of all, you didn't want anybody to know you were a former child soldier, because that meant that you could be literally lynched. It's not a joke. If you live in a neighborhood and things went missing, you're a former child soldier, whatever happened, it was your fault. Even if you were 10 miles away, it was because of you. So this was very difficult after the war to try and convince people that, look, I didn't start this war, I got caught up in it, and these are the things. I'm not saying I wasn't part of causing the problem, but I didn't start the war at all. I didn't go after recruiting children. And it was very hard because people were seeing the reminders of the hurt from the war that you could not have that discussion. Now, in my case, I was fortunate enough to be put with my uncle in the capital city after rehabilitation, where he was able to keep it a secret who I was. So in the community that he lived, people did not know. He just said, oh, it's my nephew who came from up country. And that was sufficient, but people will find out. Because how people find out, which is really bad from the point of view of the NGOs who are working with, sometimes one of the NGO workers, a very overzealous case worker, will show up at your house with the NGO vehicle, and you're like, no, come on. You just blew my cover, you know, I've been trying to blend in for a while. And then everybody, well, why did they come? Why is these white people coming with a car from? Who are you? Oh, you're one of those boys, and then the whole thing. So even to get into schools was difficult. Now, another additional thing about this in terms of rights is that when you run from war, you survive war in Sierra Leone the way I did, I was already coming from a remote part of the country, you have nothing to show of who you have been. Everything I knew about myself was in my memory. I had no documentation whatsoever, nothing. So my first time in the capital city, I knew when I was born because I'd been to school. My father had celebrated my birthday before once, I remember, so I know when I was born. So basically, documentation has to be made for you, but nobody trusts the word of a kid who has been a soldier. So when you go to tell people to make a document, they doubt you, you know. Because through the United Nations, I was selected to travel to New York to give a talk about this experience. This was when Grasa Machel had done a research, you know, she had done the publication for children in armed conflict, the big research that she did. I was one of the people she spoke to, so they brought all the young people from all over the world that she spoke to this conference. Because of that, I had a passport, and that meant a birth certificate had to be made for me so I can apply for one. And I remember also the international dimension of who I'd been began to translate to me, which is that when I went to the American Embassy to get a visa, they asked me, well, there were two questions that I thought were completely ridiculous. One of them was that I needed to have a bank statement that showed I had money in the bank, and I needed to have a documentation to show ownership of property. And these two things would guarantee that I intended to return to Sierra Leone. And I remember really laughing because I just come out of a war. I remember looking at the guy and being like, are you serious? And I said to the guy, well, let's assume that I actually had this documentation. I come from a place where I had electricity, I had money in the bank, I knew what banking systems were. Do you really think when people were shooting at you, you're running for your life, you're thinking, you know, I should print my bank statement? You know? And the guy, you know, immigration officers have no sense of humor whatsoever. Whenever you think you have a sarcasm, it's like, oh, lost. You know, come back, you can't do anything. Anyway, so but I began to realize that, but then I couldn't provide those things, but because I had the UN back and it was okay. But then the question came that you had been a former child soldier, why should we give you a visa to the United States? What if you go there and you commit violent acts? And I said, I don't even know where I'm going. And not only that, I was a kid who was coming from war, who understood the true nature of violence. I had lived it. I had experienced it, targeted towards me, I brought it to people, I knew what it was. I wanted to stay from it, away from it as much as possible. Nobody believed that. This guy could not give me that visa. The United Nations had to pressure. Because I was a former child soldier, there was a decree at that particular US embassy, don't give visas to kids who have military experience. They cannot travel because you don't know what they're going to do. So even the opportunity to do something with my life was taken away by the fact that I was considered a perpetrator in the eyes of so many. Now when I got that visa, I came to New York and I gave a talk at the UN, and this is where I met the family who adopted me. I went back to Sierra Leone. When the war reached the capital city, I had this passport, I was able to leave and return to the US, and this family adopted me. I went to school, all of that. I decided to write my first book really out of this frustration that there was very little context into the people who had experienced this war firsthand, how they wanted to contribute to this discussion. We were not asked, people made decisions for us, and so my first book came out of that frustration. I wanted to put a human face, but I also wanted to remind people, just because we've been through this experience doesn't mean that we cannot be part of the discussion, that we're not intelligent. I remember as a kid at the rehabilitation center, we would be sitting and people would discuss how we felt while we were sitting. And they were standing talking about what should be done for us, what career path we should choose, and we would look at it like, I'm sitting right here. A few days before, I was a sub-commander of a group of 400 or 500 kids. I could get them to do things. That counts for something. That's leadership skills. Used in the wrong form, but yes, refocus, and use properly. It's true. To survive war as a kid, in the context of Sierra Leone or anywhere else in the world that I've been, I've met kids, whether in South Sudan, whether in Colombia, whether in Central African Republic, you meet kids that are 13, 12, that have been sub-commanders, requires remarkable intelligence and strength of character. How many 13-year-old kids do you know at a playground who can get other 5 kids with no guns, not traumatized to behave? None. Now think about those in those contexts who have given responsibility for the wrong reasons. If you refocus, our rehabilitation center, they used to do this to us. When we first got there, we wouldn't listen to anybody because they were civilians. If they told us to do something, we would beat them up. they came up with a strategy, which was that they realized that, you know what, there's a command structure here. So they would challenge me and say, well, you're not a very good commander. You can't get your guys to go to the dining hall and eat. And I'll say to everybody, stand up, let's go to the dining hall. And everybody would go to the dining hall and eat. Now here was the leadership being used for good purpose. They had a meal, everybody was fed. It's the same with going to school. I'll say, if you guys don't go to school, I don't want to hear. You go to school, and I want ace, and all the guys that were under me would make sure they study because they don't want me to be upset, you know. And that was to go to show face. So basically what I'm saying that all that intelligence is belittled sometimes. So when discussions are happening in terms of building policy, international legal norms, we're not consulted. So over the years, one of the work that I try to do is to put ourselves in that discussion with a bunch of other young people from all over the world. From Uganda, we got together and said, we need to get to the Security Council, we need to be in the UN, we need to go to the Hague. So we started attending, for example, I was attending the Lubanga trial at ICC with Emmanuel Jab, who was from South Sudan now. And we were sitting there trying to learn what's going on with this, you know, and Ocampo was a friend, we made friends with Ocampo, we showed up, you know, and we wanted to be, you know. And so we did these things because we wanted for people to understand that we have real information that we can give that can help in the way people think about who we are and what can be done for us and how we can also become useful citizens in the world again. Now, one of the few things that I've been seeing as a gap, and I'll end my talk there, over the years traveling, some of the things I asked a question about it earlier in church, is that in the case of Sierra Leone, first of all, in the case of Sierra Leone, there was a frustration from people like me who fought in the war. And the idea was that we felt, but which some of the, you know, when the special force was set up, that there was so much precedence and due process being put in place for dealing with somebody like Charles Taylor, but not with the rest of us, you know. Where particularly when people try to attack us on the street because of whatever the case was, or even as witnesses, you know, sometimes, you know. And so some of us were a little bit like, well, why is that the case, you know? It took a while to understand that because there was a, you know, we got to understand what it was. But what I was trying to understand was that for some of us, particularly, we were upset at the fact that the Charles Taylor case never happened in West Africa. And I remember when the decision to fly into The Hague happened, I know all the kids that I fought with were very upset about it because for us, one of the things that these proceedings have done was to see the big boys who are above the law being held accountable. And we wanted to see that process firsthand. And now we couldn't see it as much. We could see it on video or whatever, it's not the same to have it on the land. So, and one of the reasons, at least that we heard of, was that security issues. If you prosecute him at a special court, that there will be, the city may fall, people may attack Freetown, and some of us who have been in the military were scratching our head and be like, that's not possible. First of all, Charles didn't have the kind of gravitas that people gave him, that he had the support of people who can launch. If you know Freetown, you know that where the special court is located, it's not easy to get to, you know. Freetown is a very strategically difficult place to attack. There's one mouth into the city, you know. So you really have to have a very sophisticated army to come in and extract him, you know, which means that we'll know who's behind it and all of that stuff. The RUF was not going to be able to do that at that point, you know. So anyway, but that was our frustration in the sense that we felt that there was no consultation in terms of really how the public felt about how some of these things happen. Now, on the other side is that when I work with the United Nations, one of the things that has been really difficult, and the young people that I encounter that tell me about is two things. One is that over the years, there hasn't been any maybe study or thinking done maybe to add resolution to amend certain things in international human rights law if that's possible, or to build something new to talk about how you move young people into another country legally when their country collapsed completely, particularly when they're trying to escape violence. So you often find young people going back into conflict the second, third, fourth time around because they can't be moved. And this was a very interesting case in Central African Republic where we had removed about 150 kids from different fighting groups in Central African Republic, and then Seleka took over the country, the capital. And these kids were basically left behind. The UN, the UNICEF that I was working with, had the money, the capacity, the place to take them, but there were so many legal hurdles because they're minors, we cannot move them outside of the country. But we had already set up places in Cameroon where they could live for a year until things calmed down, but we left them. And some of these kids were drawn back into the fighting again. And some of them were very upset. They're thinking, well, where's the justice in that? You know? And some of them went on to be adults in that fighting group now. And then we will probably have to prosecute them now as the next warlords and whatnot. You know? So where do we build international understanding? How do we deal with these issues? The other part of it is citizenship. You have a lot of children because of conflict in their parts of the world who find themselves or are born in other countries. I was in Jordan, and I was at the Zatari camp, spent a lot of time there, met a lot of kids. Jordanian law is such that even if you're born in Jordan, but you're from a Syrian parent, you can't become a Jordanian citizen. But you live there, and you can't really become a Syrian because that doesn't exist as much, you know. So you have kids who really feel they don't belong, but also belong, you know, having a kind of paper would allow them access to education, to a better life, something. They may even settle for just having partial rights of being a Jordanian citizen, not a full one, but something. And that's not possible. So I think we need to challenge some of these views, because if we're going to have the next generation who grows up believing in the rule of law, in international humanitarian law, we need to have laws in place that also shows how we protect them. And for my generation, we don't see that. We already grew up in places where we don't believe in the rule of law because we've never seen it at play, and then we're devastated by the war, and then we still don't see certain things happening for us. So there's this disbelief in the idea that this whole idea of international human rights law is kind of a fallacy to please the Western version of what justice is, but not really us. What about what we want? What is our form of justice? Can it translate into that? Are juvenile legal standards being enhanced in these countries when things are happening there? We were listening to Mohamedou yesterday. I lived in Mauritania for 2 years. In Mauritanian law, actually there are two laws in Mauritania that coexist, which doesn't make sense. So there's the regular French codified law, and then there's the Sharia law. Depending on the judge that you face, they can choose which one they want to apply. How does that even make sense? But yet, Mauritania is part of all these international legal, is signed on some things. So how do we change that? How do we impact it? Because this is impacting people's lives on the ground. Because whoever you're facing can decide, you know what? The girl was raped, she's 15, but she was a woman. Because under this version of my interpretation of Sharia law is this. And that's a losing battle, you can't. And when I was in Mauritania, we tried to talk to some of the judges. They're open, but there's nobody talking to them about how they make those changes on the governmental level. So anyway, these are some of the things that I'm thinking about, and perhaps I'll go to law school after all so that I can make those research and try to see what can happen. Now, I'm going to end. I think I've gone over time a little, but if people have a few questions, we can entertain a few. Yes. The timekeeper says yes. So, thank you for listening, and thank you to the Ukraine for insisting on so many occasions and for inviting me. I felt if I didn't come, you would have to prosecute me so much. I was like, let me go, you know. So now all my sins are forgiven.
Really? Do we have any questions?
Yeah.
Any questions? Anybody has any questions?
Oh, gosh. That's not like this group. No questions?
Maybe I did a good job.
You did. There we go.
Yeah. Yes.
Thank you very much for a fantastic talk. It's fantastic. It's wonderful to hear your story. I'd love to hear your thoughts about the kind of working within the UN system. I'm Untitled Chapter here, spent many years working in the UN, and I think that there's pros and cons of working within the system versus outside the system, but I think it's important that there's entrepreneurs, people inside the system that are making it work.
Yes.
What are the kind of strengths and weaknesses you see for the institution you're in, and how do you think you can best make it more effective from from sitting inside the building?
Well, I believe one of the powers of the United Nations is access. It has access to places that very few people can go to, and now what it can do with that access is debatable. Right? And one of the issues that I think I have with the organization is that there are lots of people working for the organization with soft skills, not hard skills. We need more lawyers, economists, people who can think policy and actually structure. So there are lots of things that are. And also, depending on the country office and who is in charge of whatever organization that's there, you're smiling because you know, right? That basically means that the programs can work really well or not, you know? So, but there are a lot of people, for example, you know, when have you seen the last time that UN programs really do like they launch a study about the economic situation on the ground and then try to come up with it. They don't go in that depth of things, you know, but it requires a certain kind of profession for people to do that. So I think there's a need for a lot of hard skills in the organization. That being said, I think the organization also, to be truly honest, has a way of rewarding a lot of incompetence. You know, people who really want, people who ask questions, who want to go beyond, who see things, who have foresight, and who shake things up are not encouraged to stay or to do long. They will leave you hanging and drying very quickly if you shake certain things, you know. And the bureaucracy is a lot as well, you know. So there are all too many. There are things that are very straightforward that can be done, and other things like that. For example, when I was in Central African Republic, I was on a task force there to kind of, somehow I met a few people and they said, well, you should come to the meetings. And I said, sure, I'll come to the meetings. I was there. I was there because of my wife. So actually, I wasn't supposed to be there under the UN mandate. But I said, I'm an African person. I can go in any African country I want. So I'll go. You know, if you don't like it, fine. Revoke my passport. I have the other one. You know? So I was there. So I always cause this sort of trouble. So I was there and I was explaining to them that the guys you're talking to, the warlords, don't think you're intelligent. And they said, well, that's not true. Yes, they don't think you're intelligent. And I'll tell you the reasons why. They didn't want to hear it. You know? The guy who was leading Seleka at the time, when they took over the capital, I knew when it was going to happen, not because I talked to him, just by watching what he was doing. He expressed interest in coming to the capital city to sit around with the government and everything. Now, this is a guy who has just got all the fighting forces together. He was about some kilometers from the capital city. When have you ever seen a rebel group that's that close that then express peace interest in having peace? They don't. It's already too close. He can sack the city anytime he wants. He was only coming to gather the last few intelligence he needed to take over. And I said, don't have the meeting. Say to him, if you're really interested, disband, don't have, you know. No, he came, they encouraged him. He said, okay, I got to go back to my commanding officers and tell them what I've learned. And then the next day they were in the city. They take care of the blueprint. The guys think you're not intelligent. So what I'm saying is that there are a lot of people who are in charge of things who don't know anything, but yet they make real decisions and they're not willing to listen to others, you know, and that makes it difficult. But that being said, there are some remarkable people, not the number that would like, still that work in the UN that would do excellent work. Yeah. Zainab is one of them. She and I ran across each other in some various difficult places. I'll be getting off most dysfunctional UN plane. I mean, she'll be getting off and I'll be getting on. So I knew at least it was okay because Zainab is fluid. So we will see each other going to do something. I'll be going somewhere anyway. But we have excellent people, but sometimes they get frustrated and the work is very taxing emotionally and people stop because it's... All right, thank you.